And that's the plan, so I understand it. So, yes, let's just...
I actually got pretty good projection. It doesn't look like it's going to be a big loop, so I'm happy to belt it out if that would be easier.
It's just being recorded.
Oh.
So it would be better to be
Okay.
So if you could, just when you finish, it's not on at the moment, just kind of just behind.
Okay.
Okay?
Yep.
Turn it on.
Yep.
Okay, that's all right. And then I'm going to turn it on. And then she'll control it in the back. I'll tell her to turn that mic off
When I get done.
when you get done.
And that way.
That way it doesn't interfere and stuff.
And she's.
She's, yes, that's what I understand. And they'll just sit there. And so we're just going to keep her on one wireless. Test 1, 2. Let's go with that thing.
Make sure we have a good camera here.
Morning, how are you? No, afternoon actually, at this point. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction. So, my understanding, how long are you, well let me just ask you, how long do you think you were going to be speaking?
40 minutes.
Okay, and then Dave for about 15 minutes is my understanding? And then, so I'll introduce you, I'll come back and introduce Dave, and then I will open it up for questions, but then I'll sit down. I think Eric had asked me to sort of field questions, but I think it's easier for you to just do that if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
that's great.
Good.
Terrific. I should make sure I have my notes in the right order here.
Okay, let me let you get at those then.
Yeah.
So good afternoon. Thank you. This is what happens when you give them food. Good afternoon. Thank you, Craig. So I'm really impressed at how many of you are able to turn out this afternoon and resist this first spring afternoon. So thank you very much. My name is Jim Wyckoff, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar exploring the past and future of American higher education. We're really pleased today to have Suzanne Mettler join us to discuss her new book, Degrees of Inequality, How Higher Education Politics Sabotaged the American Dream. Following Suzanne's remarks, our colleague Dave Brenneman will offer some of his thoughts on the same topic. Then we'll have time for questions. Following that, I think Suzanne will be available for signing the book. Professor Mettler is the Clinton Rossiter Professor of Government at Cornell University. Her research and teaching interests focus on public policy and the American welfare state, education policy, civic engagement, and inequality. Professor Mettler's previous work includes prize-winning books, The Submerged State, How Invisible Government Policies Undermined American Democracy, and Soldiers to Citizens, the GI Bill and the Making of the Greatest Generation. In addition, Professor Mettler has published many articles in leading journals, including the American Political Science Review, as well as op-ed pieces in the New York Times and the LA Times, and has contributed to Washington Monthly and Salon. Mettler's research has been supported by several foundations, including Russell Sage, Spencer, and Robert Wood Johnson. She is the past president of the Politics and History section of APSA and the president-elect of the association's Public Policy section. Please welcome Suzanne Mettler.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and thank you all for coming. It's lovely to be here. I've been fortunate to have several visits to the University of Virginia in the past several years, and I always enjoy it. There's always such warm hospitality here and real intellectual engagement, and it's lovely to have sunshine as well, coming from upstate New York, where we can't really celebrate spring for a couple more months. So great to be here. I want to begin by telling you about a couple of people. So first of all, this man is Richard Colosimo. He was a World War II veteran, and I met him in the late 1990s when I was working on my book on the GI Bill. And like many of the veterans I interviewed, he had grown up poor. Richard had grown up, he was first generation American. His parents were from Italy, He said that during the Depression, they missed meals a lot of the time, and he had no hope of going on for advanced education beyond high school. World War II came along, he served in the military, and when he came back home, all of a sudden he learned about this policy that had been created, the GI Bill. So he used it, first of all, in the way that most people did who used it for education or training, and that is he went to a vocational training program. I remember him saying to me, well, I decided television is the coming thing. I'll learn how to become a television repairman. So he went to school and he did that, and along the way discovered that he was actually a really good student and he enjoyed school. So then he had more eligibility for the GI Bill, so he enrolled in college. And he ended up getting a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, became an engineer thanks to the GI Bill, and had a very different life than he ever could have imagined when he was growing up. When he looked back at the GI Bill, he said to me, it was rather magnanimous. And his story was like the story of many other Americans who came of age during the middle of the 20th century, from the creation of the GI Bill up through the National Defense Education Act, the Higher Education Act of 1965, and then Pell Grants in 1972. And for many Americans, this meant their ticket to opportunity to go to college, and college became thought of as this pathway to the American dream. And at the same point in time, states were investing in their public colleges and universities. So this combination of federal student aid bills and state investment enabled this to happen. Now we flash forward to the present. And this woman's name is Martine Levesque. And she is a single parent who is struggling, working in California in various low-paying jobs, and finally decided, I've got to do something. She was just a high school graduate. She decided, I've got to do something to improve my opportunities. I'll go to nursing school. So she looked online and learned about Everest College, which is one of the Corinthian colleges, part of the for-profit sector. And so she called them up, and they quickly brought her in, and they said, look, you should do this. You're not going to have to pay much out of pocket at all right away. You'll take out these loans, but no problem repaying them later, because our graduates have all of these great opportunities. And so she was a little nervous about the fine print, and she said, could I take the forms home and look them over? They said, no, sign right now, just do this right now. Before she knew it, she was in this program, and the training wasn't what she had been led to believe. It wasn't very good at all. She finished her degree, was not able to get a job as a nurse with that degree, and meanwhile had racked up about $33,000 in student loan debt. And here she is still able to only work in these low-paying jobs. So she was really worse off than if she'd never gone to college in the first place. And unfortunately, her story is representative of a growing number of students today. So what I have come to think in studying what's going on in higher education over the last several years is that we're seeing a transformation today in higher education from it being a real path to the American dream to becoming a stratified system that reinforces inequality in many ways. Now, I should quickly say, for many people, it still provides tremendous upward mobility, and there's really nothing else that a person can do, which is a better investment in their lives. Economists actually quantify this. You know, if you compare it to the real estate market and the stock market and so on, you're better off investing in a college education. But we have to add a lot of qualifiers to that, because the system is becoming quite stratified and with very different outcomes for different people. And so I have been studying this and trying to understand what's going on. And to just fast forward to where I'm going, I focus on what's happened in public policy. And I think that we've had a political failure in this area, that we have existing policies from the past that need maintenance, that need upkeep if they're going to continue to have the effects they were created to have. But in our current political environment, we're doing a very bad job of that. And that's what I'm going to be illuminating. So first, let me show you some of the trends. Now, the United States, as recently as around 1980, was the international leader in terms of college graduation rates. And so for people who today are my age and a little bit older, we are the most highly educated of our cohort group around the world. But since that point in time, about 10 other nations have leapfrogged over us. So young Americans today are barely more likely to have a college degree than my generation and my older siblings' generation, whereas many other countries have surpassed us. Then if you look at who's getting college degrees today, here's the story. Today, for people who grow up in the top income quartile in the United States, going to college is the norm. Most people go, and about 71% complete a 4-year bachelor's degree by the time they're 24 years old. And that's a great improvement on 1970. But if you look at the other 75% of the income spectrum, college graduation rates are still surprisingly low. And for those below median income, they've barely increased since the 1970s, being only at 15% now for the second income quartile, and for the lowest income quartile, it's only 1 in 10 Americans who get a 4-year college degree by age 24. Now, you're probably saying, whoa, too many numbers up here, but let me give you some indication of what's going on in this table. The point here is that today, it's not just whether or not a person enrolls in college, but it's also at which institution and in which sector you attend college. We need to kind of look below the hood at the sector and the particular individual institution to see how the outcomes are. Now, there's lots of talk today about the problems of high tuition and high student loan debt. But to my mind, that conversation often obscures more than it reveals, because you really need to look at the distinctions between sectors. Now, if you are at a private nonprofit institution or at a public flagship like here at UVA, there are really great outcomes. Students borrow some money, but it turns out to be a great investment for the vast majority of students because there are high graduation rates and relatively low student debt that people are then, given the job market available to them, they're able to repay that student loan debt fairly easily. And graduation rates are quite high. If you compare the cost of publics to the private nonprofits, you can see that publics are by far the most affordable and have very positive outcomes in that regard. So despite the fact that students are borrowing, they're not borrowing all that much money. And the private nonprofits, it's also somewhat deceptive because at the average student at the average school is only paying about half of sticker price because of the financial aid they receive. But if you look at the top line of data, the for-profits, here we get a really different story. These schools charge what I found to be surprisingly high tuition. It's much more than what publics charge on average, even though a student could often get the same kind of training at a public institution. Their graduation rates are very low, 22%, and almost all students who attend them borrow. And they borrow very large amounts of money. And then default rates are very high among these students. So more on that later. But my point here is that we're seeing increasing stratification based on what colleges people attend. So if you add all of that up, we're seeing growing inequality emerging out of higher education today. And the question is, why? So a lot of people talk about tuition. It's all about tuition and the increase in the cost of college. And certainly college costs have increased much more rapidly than inflation. That's undeniable. And I think there's probably economists in the room who could talk about why that is, what this service sector that depends on highly skilled labor requires in terms of rising costs and so on. But what I want to say is that it's not all about rising tuition. We also have to look at the role of government, because in the United States, government has always played a role in promoting higher education. So it has always, to some extent, to varying extents, subsidized the actual cost of higher education to individuals and families. And so we need to look at what's changed in the extent to which it does that today. And here you have the reason why I show Abraham Lincoln and Senator Morrill from Vermont is about the 1862 passage of the Morrill Act, which was, of course, a really significant policy for government support of higher education. Then many other people will say to me, well, it's all about aptitude. There are more students going to college today who come from less advantaged backgrounds, and they're not prepared for college, and subsequently they drop out, they don't finish. Well, when you look at surveys about why people drop out of college, the most commonly cited reason is financial. They couldn't afford it. And then the next reason is that they were having to work too much on the side and they couldn't keep up with their studies. And of course they're working so that they can pay tuition. If you look at this graph, what it's showing you is students' scores, students of different income groups, what their scores were on math exams that they took before they went to college. And I draw your attention to the fact that the low-income students who were high scorers, 30% of them got college degrees, which is just about the same amount as the percentage of high-income people with low scores, which suggests that there's something going on about people's ability to pay for college, and it's not just about aptitude and preparation. So I've been studying this for several years, and I did a variety of different kinds of research. I did a lot of analysis of government documents and the historical record. I did a lot of interviews with people in Washington, D.C., so staffers on Capitol Hill, some members of Congress, some representatives of organizations that are part of One DuPont Circle, the higher education lobby of trade associations, and various leaders of consumer groups and student groups and so on, and some agency officials as well. And then I also do some statistical analysis of historical data about state-level spending on higher ed and try to look at what the determinants of it are. So it's a whole variety of things that I pull together into this book. So now I'll give you in a nutshell my explanation of what I come down to for the big argument of the book. I'm coining a new term here, and the term is the policyscape. Today in contemporary political life, we live in this environment that is cluttered with policies that are created at earlier points in time. And these policies over time can create all sorts of effects that have to be dealt with in politics so they can really reshape the political environment. And they also need maintenance. They need upkeep if they're going to continue to have the effects that they might have had back in the day. When I interviewed former Senator Nancy Kassebaum, Republican from Kansas, she said to me, public programs, like all programs, need to be managed. And she had been the chair or the ranking Republican on the Senate Education and Labor Committee for much of the time that she served in Congress. And she remembers a time when this sort of bipartisan atmosphere was common in higher education policymaking, where she and Ted Kennedy, while they had real differences, worked respectfully together and could find some common ground. And she feels that that's not happening today. And indeed, I agree with her from studying what's going on. In the book, highlight three kinds of policy effects that need to be managed. One is that policies are designed in different ways, and some become more easily sustainable, and others are harder to maintain. So for example, Pell Grants for low-income students don't have cost of living adjustments in them. So they naturally fall behind in real value unless lawmakers, through the very contentious budget process, manage to, year after year, increase their value. Student loans, by contrast, it's much easier to grow student loans. You can have real division between lawmakers, but they can say, well, let's just allow more students to borrow more money. And so not surprisingly, over time, student loans became the more prominent source of student aid compared to Pell Grants. Unintended consequences can proliferate in public policies, and I'm particularly interested in the consequences where policies create some incentive for a particular industry to do more of what it does or to do something it wasn't already doing so that it can take advantage of available federal dollars. And quite a bit of this has happened in the higher ed arena. And then there are also what I call lateral effects. And the example I'd give is that you have other policies, not the policy in question, not higher ed policies, but their growth can affect the policy you're looking at. So when we look at the state level, we'll see that the growth of Medicaid costs and K-12 education costs and so on have been competing with higher ed costs, and higher ed has lost out. So those are the sorts of dynamics I see. And what I'm arguing is the extent to which lawmakers intervene and update those policies and maintain them depends upon the political context. As recently as the late 1980s and early 1990s, lawmakers were managing to reach across the aisle and to come up with some real reform possibilities for these kinds of problems. But then much more polarization occurred in Congress from around 1993, 94, 95 to the present. And that's made it much more difficult. And that governs a lot of what's happened in higher ed policy or failed to happen. And then there's also been what I call plutocratic governance, where in some instances you see lawmakers coming together across the aisle in a bipartisanship, but in order to be responsive to those powerful vested interests that manage to take advantage of the unintended consequences and to make profits off of existing policies. So now let me exemplify this through the three policy areas that I look at in the book. First of all, federal student aid. Now, here you have President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 signing into law the Higher Education Act. And he went back to Southwest Texas State College, which was his alma mater, in order to sign into law this bill. And this is still in place. Okay, and it's supposed to be reauthorized every several years, and it includes student loans and Pell Grants and so on in its Title IV. So the question is, what's happened over time with this? Well, if you take a look at this graph, the dotted line shows you the cost of tuition in real terms over time at the average four-year public university. So it's gone way up. Pell Grants are indicated by the green line, and as you can see, after being at a relative high point in real terms in the 1970s, then they really lagged behind in real terms for the next couple of decades, and meanwhile, tuition is going way up, so as a relative portion of tuition, they're way behind. They've been increased quite a bit just since 2007, and I'll say more about that later, but they're still way behind in terms of their purchasing power. Back in the 70s, they allowed a student to pay for nearly 80% of the cost of tuition fees, room and board at the average public university. Today, they cover about 31%. So dramatic difference, which means that students instead turn to borrowing. And the red line is showing you the dramatic increase in average student loan debt for students attending public universities. So the question is, why has this happened? And here I'm turning the story to polarization, the rise of partisan polarization in Congress. If you look back on the left-hand side of this graph, those are the middle years of the 20th century, when partisan polarization was relatively low. And this happens to be the point in time where our major landmark policies in higher ed were created. The GI Bill, the National Defense Education Act, signed into law by Eisenhower in 1958. Note, Republican president was signing that into law, Higher Education Act, and then Pell Grants signed into law by Nixon in 1972. We haven't had comparable landmark policies since that point in time, as partisan polarization has risen so dramatically. The red and green lines here are showing you general partisan polarization across all kinds of votes, all kinds of issues in both the House and the Senate. The gray bars are showing you the gap between members of each political party in votes on higher ed legislation. And so those really tall bars over on the right-hand side are just on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act but have become very contentious issues. Here I took a look at votes on amendments to the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act from 1971 to 2008 and looked at the gap in partisan support in each chamber, the House and the Senate. The House is blue, the Senate's red. And what you'll see again here is the rising partisan gaps over time, which is an indication of if it's this hard to agree on the issues that are part of amendments, it's no surprise that we haven't come up with major new solutions to the problems of growing stratification and inequality in higher ed. I also have to note in looking at federal student aid that it's not that we haven't done anything new. The major new thing that's happened at this point in time is solutions through the tax system. And these are really costly alternatives that don't have much of an impact for increasing access to higher education. So Clinton promoted these first, and it was the idea was really opposed by most of his advisors. It was Dick Morris, his pollster, who said this idea polled well. And so against the opinions of his advisors, he ran on this against Bob Dole and in the 1996 election, and then signed them into law in 1997. And they were, more of this kind of thing was established by President George W. Bush during his presidency, and then Obama really greatly expanded them much more in the stimulus bill in 2009, so that they've become quite costly in terms of lost revenues to the federal budget, and they are going, the largest share now goes to families that are fairly well off, but they don't increase access because of the way they're delivered, which is long after people are enrolled in college and paying tuition. So they don't help to shape that decision of someone who's trying to decide up front whether they can afford to go to college or not. Now I turn to the second major area I look at, which is the sinking support for public universities and colleges. Now, 73% of American college students attend public universities and colleges today, but after the many decades during the middle of the 20th century of great investment by states in public universities and colleges, it's really fallen behind in almost any way that you measure it. So state spending per student who's attending a public has declined by 26% in real terms from 1990 to 2010. And what the institutions have done instead is to shift costs to students and families, and so tuition has gone up by 113% over that time period. And at the same time, there's been declining graduation rates. So institutions, besides increasing tuition, have had to cut resources and put more students in the classroom, turn to more online alternatives as a way of saving money, and cut back on support services. And so scholars find that all of this is a deterrent to strong graduation rates. And so that's very problematic. Now, I was a little bit boggled when I put this graph together. If you look at the percentage of family income by income quintile to afford to go to your average four-year public university, it's increased dramatically as a percentage of family income for people in really I would say, the bottom 80%. I mean, for people who are in the top quintile, it's gone up from 6 to 9%. And you know, to be honest, I always feel like I'm at dinner parties with my friends who are here in this top quintile, and everyone complains about college tuition. But you know, when you look at this and what this takes away from families in every other income quintile, and if you sit down and actually do the math as what percentage of your income this is, it's really quite striking. And of course, for people in the bottom two quintiles, it's prohibitive. So this makes a huge difference in terms of whether people enroll or not in the first place, and whether once enrolled, they stay enrolled and graduate. So why has this happened? Now, probably many of you have heard some of the results of economists' work on this in the past, and I redid some of this myself in the book, but looking over long periods of time to look at the determinants by states of investment in higher ed. And what I found is comparable to what others have found, is that there's been increasing competition with K-12 education, with Medicaid, and with spending on prisons, and those things are a deterrent to spending on higher ed. And more about the tax revenues in a moment. But lawmakers have become increasingly aware of this. And so in 2010, Schwarzenegger gave a speech about it, and I'm not going to try to imitate his voice, but he said, "The priorities have become out of whack over the years. What does it say about any state that focuses more on prison uniforms than on caps and gowns? It simply is not healthy." And California at that point in time was spending much more on prisons than it was on higher education, which is a real reversal from the past and from its days of the master plan in California. But another thing that became clear to me through my research is the importance of revenues. This man is named Douglas Bruce. He is someone who moved to Colorado in 1986, and he drafted what was called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and it helped to galvanize an anti-tax movement there at that point in time. And it was eventually passed by voters in 1992. And what it means is that now in Colorado, you can't increase tax revenues unless you take it to the public in a vote on a referendum on the ballot, and a majority of voters agree to it, which is a really difficult way to run fiscal policy. It turns out that in Colorado, young adults today they're less likely to have gone to college than people who are my age and older, which is really striking because, we assume that more and more people are going to college over time. College is increasingly important for how people do, and so that's pretty striking. But what happened in Colorado has happened in a lot of states. Since the 1970s, about half of states have adopted new policies that make it very difficult to raise taxes. And this is a time of rising economic inequality when it's very likely that in a lot of states, tax policy really should be revised and changed in various ways so that it's more equitable and so that there are more funds available for things like higher ed. What I found in looking at the data is that states that have not the states that have been willing to increase revenues have not faced the trade-off between the other policy areas and higher ed. They've continued their commitment to each of them. Now we turn to the final part of my story, which is about the rise of the for-profit colleges. Now, so here is the puzzle for you. Here we are in the most polarized Congress in modern history, and yet we have various policies where all of these people, and many others, agree, vote on the same side. This happened in the U.S. House of Representatives in various votes in recent years to support the for-profit college industry against the kind of regulations that the Obama administration was trying to devise in the Department of Ed, and which it's now working on again. And so these brought together all of these elected officials and many more. It brought together all Republicans, in fact, and about 60 Democrats in the House on each of these votes. So what could have brought all of these people together? Well, first of all, what the Democrats will say is that these for-profit colleges, which I should actually back up for a second, for-profit colleges were, as recently as the early 90s, they were around 1 to 2% of all college students enrolled in them. Now it's actually up to the latest data that just came out is 13%. So they've been increasing rapidly. They've grown as some of them, like the University of Phoenix and Corinthian Colleges, Education Management Corporation, have become vast multi-state enterprises, and they're, the top 14 of them are publicly traded on Wall Street. And they've been growing very rapidly over this point in time. Now, what Democrats will say is that they promote opportunity, that they really help low-income people. And it is the case that these schools really recruit heavily among low-income communities. But when you look, as I was showing you at the beginning, at the data, it doesn't look so strong. The graduation rates are 22%, 94% of students borrow to get a BA degree, and the median borrowing is $33,000. And these students account for 47% of all student loan defaults. 23% of them default within just 3 years. So that's a very high percentage of people who end up really being worse off pretty quickly for having gone to college. Republicans today will defend them as being part of the private sector. Yesterday when I was flying down here, I was sitting next to a man on the plane who, by the time the flight had happened, I had not read a word of my student's dissertation that I was supposed to read, but he had learned all about my book, and he was delightful, so it was nice to chat with him. But it was when I told him this next statistic that he nearly fell out of his chair, and he said, "You have to start your talk with that." So here we go. This is what I should have started with. The for-profits are allowed by law to receive up to 90% of their revenues from the federal government. To be more specific, they're allowed to receive 90% of their revenues from one public policy, Title IV of the Higher Education Act. They can receive more above and beyond that from other federal public policies, such as the GI Bill and other military education programs. The average of the top 15 of them receive 86% of their revenues from the Higher Education Act, Title IV. On the right-hand side, you'll see these nice graphics that the New York Times put together with my op-ed, where they tried to indicate this. So there you have the Apollo Group is getting 89% of its revenues. The Apollo Group owns the University of Phoenix and some other schools. So they're the largest. So they get 89% of their revenues from government and just 11% from elsewhere. It's also the case that students attending these now account for about 1 in 4 federal student aid dollars that are allocated under the Higher Education Act, 37% of what is allocated under the post-9/11 GI Bill, and 50% of Department of Defense education programs. So the claim that they're the private sector, while they're privately owned and they make profits for their shareholders on Wall Street, they're certainly not privately supported to a great extent. Now, what's so interesting to me is looking at the politics of this. And first, before you focus on these people, let me back up for a moment. The controversy around the for-profits began back right after World War II. This is really interesting. As soon as federal money was available under the GI Bill, I hope you can hear me. I just realized I never turned on my microphone. Okay, if my voice is getting weak at this point, now I have some help. Right after World War II, schools grew up overnight. They mushroomed, and they were the early for-profits. They were called trade schools at the time, and it's the kind of school that Richard Colosimo went to become a television repairman. Students then didn't go into debt to go to those schools, I should note. However, members of Congress became very disturbed about them because they thought a lot of them were sham schools, rip-off schools, taking advantage of veterans and not providing good training. So they had a lot of investigations. These were bipartisan affairs. When they created the Korean War GI Bill, they started to regulate these schools and what they could get out of the GI Bill. A similar story happens after these schools become eligible for money out of the Higher Education Act for civilian students. Problems crop up, and in the 1980s, there was a lot of consternation in Congress across the aisle about what was happening. And so you had William Bennett, Secretary of Education in the Reagan administration, who said, these schools are milking the federal government. We need to regulate them. And you had Bob Dole, who with Phil Gramm introduced legislation in 1990 to try to scale back what they could get from the federal government. So Republicans. You also had moderate Democrat from Georgia, Sam Nunn, who his committee had a year's worth of hearings about the for-profits. And striking to me is that every member of that committee, Democrat and Republican, signed onto the committee report and said something must be done about these schools. And Maxine Waters is someone who, in representing South Central Los Angeles, she told me when I interviewed her, my constituents are hurt by these schools. They're taken advantage of, very low-income people taken advantage of by these schools. And so she has worked in Congress since the early 1990s to try to restrain their funding and to hold them accountable. However, that politics has changed so much. Maxine Waters is still there, articulating the same message she was before, but what's happened since then is a very different politics. Republicans have moved away from the fiscal conservative concerns that they were articulating back in as recently as the early 90s, and now they, across the board, support the for-profits. So in my interpretation, what's going on there is the work of polarization. Their leadership decided this is an industry we're going to support, we like it, it's the private sector in higher education. And because of polarization, it becomes much easier to get everybody to line up. There's more homogeneity within the party and how it operates. For Democrats, it's been a somewhat different dynamic that's come into play. Once the for-profit industry had Republicans on their side, it made it easier for them because they could focus on the Democrats. So what they've done, and I learned this through all of these interviews, they've hired many, as lobbyists, many former Democratic lawmakers in Congress and former Democratic staffers from Capitol Hill. And those people reach out to their social and political networks in the party and have brought on board enough Democrats to support them so that they get a winning majority. So there's been substantial deregulation in the late 1990s and up through 2005, 2006, and now continues to be in the House of Representatives, resistance to regulation. So that is a quick summary of lots of detailed stories that I tell in this book. But let me conclude by saying this. We are squandering one of the United States' finest accomplishments and historic legacies, a system of higher education that was long characterized by excellence and wide accessibility to what seemed to be an ever wider and more diverse group of citizens. As a result of these trends, we are producing too few highly educated workers to provide the innovation and creativity the economy requires. Our international competitiveness is fading. The ranks of those who participate intensely in the political process is growing more unequal, and the American dream is increasingly out of reach for many citizens. From the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the Morrill Act of 1862, to Pell Grants in 1972, the United States found ways to promote broad public purposes through innovative policies to advance higher education. We need to find ways to do so again for our own time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. At the Batten School, David Brenneman needs no introduction. Nonetheless, I'll provide a very brief introduction for David, who will provide a few comments on Suzanne's remarks. David Brenneman is a university professor and the Newton and Rita Myers Professor in the Economics of Education at the Curry School of Education. David has importantly shaped both the Batten School and the Curry School. He served as director of the Public Policy Program at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy from 2006 to 2009, and as senior associate dean at the Batten School during the 2012-2013 academic year. Prior to that, he was dean at the Curry School from 1995 to 2007. And from 1983 to 1989, he served as president of Kalamazoo College. Professor Brenneman is the author of, or co-author of 12 books and numerous journal articles and reports. His most recent book he co-authored was titled Financing American Higher Education in an Era of Globalization. David has received numerous academic honors and awards and serves on several boards. Please welcome David Brenneman.
Computer. Is this broadcasting all right? Great. I want to begin by saying I know, I'm sure I speak for Eric Tashnik, who, for very sad reasons, his grandmother passed away recently, couldn't be here. He had arranged this meeing and I guess is in been a friend of Suzanne's for many years and was very excited about it. And I know he wishes he could be here for this purpose. This is an excellent book. It's well researched. It's insightful. It has wonderful legislative histories that I think were great fun to read. In fact, I don't know if you'll take this as a compliment or not, but some of the chapters almost read like a thriller. I mean, you sort of, there was kind of this take you up to the edge, and then, so it had some of the hallmarks of a good novel, which is for a field like this is no small feat to turn that into something interesting. And it's extremely well written. It's a good read, and I learned a good bit from it. When I used to work on the economics of higher education, or had worked on it, I remember way back in 1978 at Brookings we did a book, and I was very frustrated because I didn't find there to be a politics of higher education of comparable merit to go along with the economics of higher education, and it was abundantly clear that the politics of higher education was really probably mostly in the driver's seat. And yet at that time, people writing on it from that perspective were mostly limited to kind of case histories and war stories, and fine, you can learn something from that, but it wasn't terribly intellectually satisfying. So I think this book makes a move toward producing that kind of framework. And I love this word policyscape. You coined it. Oh, that's great. I'm going to modify its meaning briefly. I figure it's so new, it's still open for interpretation. I want to add something to it, and will in a moment. And I won't repeat your general framework, the political polarization, the plutocracy. I think those are important and accurate descriptions of our situation. And I would say that, I think I'm not misreading the author, that what she's done in the field of higher education, that idea, that framework could be imposed on almost any domestic policy area around. I think it transfers. It's not something that's uniquely and only suited to higher education. The structure of the book, 7 chapters, primarily focuses on the federal government. There's the one state-focused chapter, which, in all honesty, didn't break a lot of new ground. To talk about state policy in higher education is to write almost 50 different books. That's a terribly difficult part of that subject, and would have surely required you to do another book. I think you used Colorado as kind of your one principal example, and a very good one. 3 chapters focus on the for-profits, and that's certainly, I've written on that subject in a modest way, and that certainly is a new kid on the block and warrants a good bit of attention. And the final chapter is really a kind of a plea for us to get back to our common sense, to our roots, to the things that made us potentially great, to regain the public purposes of another era. Now, it was fun to read about this because I was in Washington from 1972 to 1983, most of that time at the Brookings Institution, mostly writing about higher education and federal policy. So I actually lived through some of these, was in the city where some of this stuff was going on. And for me, the one missing part of the story, and I wonder if I could have my bottle of water. I just want to make sure what was that, Martin, the famous Rubio incident? Fortunately, we're not being filmed, so no. The missing part of the story is the intellectual ferment on this topic that was going on mostly among economists at this time. And it was that ferment that I missed in the policyscape, because I think it was a very, very important part of the policyscape, and it helps to explain, it adds explanatory power to the trends that are, I think in a way, one of the most significant books that got that going was Lee Hansen and Burton Weisbrod's little book published in 1969 called The Benefits, Cost, and Finance of Public Higher Education. It was at that time, almost shocking to people, critique of the California master plan and its 3 tiers, which everybody, OECD, everybody in the world thought was the future of higher education. This is a brilliant masterstroke by Clark Kerr and his colleagues to set this tiered structure up. What Hansen and Weisbrod did was go in and looked at the question of who's paying for this. This was an era when there was no tuition, effectively, zero tuition or very low tuition in California. And and who was attending and who was benefiting. And their basic, simple conclusion was, in a sense, kind of the conclusion you've reached for today, which was it was the wealthy kids in California, by and large, who were attending UC, who were getting very high resources per student through the higher appropriations per student to UC. Sort of the middle class went to CSU, and then the poor kids went to the community colleges. And if you looked at the tax system, on balance across all of the tax revenues in the state of California, it was regressing. So the basic message that came out of their book is, this is a massive scam. It's transferring resources from the poor to the rich, and the whole system is not working well. Well, that was a shocking, kind of horrifying report when it came out. And I can remember at Brookings, people in the early 70s were battling with it and trying to dispute it and arguing back and forth. There was a long literature on that. But I think that the core of what they were saying really struck home. And then the Education Amendments of '72, the huge battle there was aid to students versus aid to the institutions. And that got resolved on behalf of basic opportunity grants, which became Pell Grants, which is aid to students, let them carry it. It's kind of a voucher model. And the economic arguments behind that were very interesting, because what the economists that were involved, and this was Alice Rivlin at that moment was head of, she was the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HEW, and she and her policy staff, and interestingly enough, the Carnegie Commission, headed by Clark Kerr, came down on the side of aid to students as opposed to continuing the institutionally based aid that had been the hallmark of the Higher Education Act of '65. And part of the logic behind the people at HEW was the view that public financing, broad public financing of particularly public higher education with high appropriations and low tuition was enormously inequitable, that this was a terribly inefficient, inequitable way to fund higher education, that you were giving, and if you start thinking about that with student aid as your model, you'd never design a need-based student aid program that had the distributive effects of low tuition, high appropriation, because even at that time, the higher income families were the ones attending places like the flagship campuses at very low tuition. The argument was they'd go there at 10 times the price with their own funds, and what you ought to be doing is targeting subsidies on the very people for whom it made a difference, and not giving it, like dropping money out of helicopters, to people who would have done the precisely same thing without that heavy level of subsidy. So there was a curious fascination with basically trying to move the system to high tuition, high aid. And that became the mantra. And I think virtually every economist of higher education during that era bought into that notion that we should be targeting all of our subsidy on the low-income kids for whom it made a difference, and inevitably letting some of the costs to those families who could afford it go up. And there was also, during this period, I remind you too, it's strange to think about it now, except if you're thinking about the small privates, there was a great fear in the 70s that the private higher, and by private I don't mean for profit, I mean private nonprofit, higher education was under enormous threat from the low tuition public universities. So there was also a kind of strand in this thinking of, we've got to make the playing field a little more level for private colleges. Howard Bowen, one of my great idols, president of Grinnell College and of the University of Iowa and Claremont chain, was following the economics of 100 small private colleges, and the tuition gap, public and private, was a growing fear at that time. So there were a lot of forces operating, but we began, the economists, I think, began this push toward a different way of financing higher education. than the one that had existed historically. Now, my old boss, Joe Peckman at Brookings, when he realized what we were doing, thought we were nuts. He was a poor kid whose family had migrated from somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he had gone to City College for the price of a dime subway ride, and he could never understand, and he may have been well right, why did things change at grade 13? Why do we do free public education up through grade 12? And so he had no sympathy with this. And actually the public university presidents had no sympathy with this either. They were deeply wedded and committed to the low tuition model. And what interests me now is how radically they have changed. I mean, public university presidents now thirst to raise tuition. I mean, there's been a massive cultural shift in the attitudes of public university officials in this world. Now, the other piece that was going on there, apart from the Pell Grants, there was another little program created in '72 called SSIG, State Student Incentive Grants. And that program never realized the potential that its creators wanted for it, but it was a kind of Medicaid-like program in which if a state started a need-based student aid program, the feds would match it. Say, it was a sliding scale, but let's say dollar for dollar. And if you put your money into appropriations for institutions, fine, you didn't get any matching aid. And the hope was, in the minds of the creators, that would cause state governments to shift away from the support of institutions and into need-based financial aid, and the whole thing would start to follow the federal pattern of a completely need-based system of financial aid to students, with public universities forced to raise their tuition to roughly the level of cost in the extreme, and people having been subsidized to pay that tuition. Definitely supported by the folks at HEW and by the Kerr Commission. And it was thought, the people who were designing this thought they were proposing something that was both more efficient and more equitable. One small thing that I'd also mentioned that I found missing in the story was, which I think is illustrative of this period, was the Middle Income Student Assistance Act, which occurred in 1978, I believe. And that was, once we got the Pell Grant thing going, there suddenly became this great fear, the rich can afford it, the poor are being financed, subsidized, and the middle class is the group that's losing out. The middle income melt became the mantra. And I watched that spread like wildfire on Capitol Hill. The members of Congress were lashing about in every direction to do something for the middle income families that they felt were haranguing them. Tuition tax credits came up at that point. It's come up every year since at least '65. And the way they got around it at that time was to raise the eligibility for Pell Grants to much higher incomes. So they stretched the money. They didn't add a lot to it, but they stretched it further up the income scale. And they uncapped GSL so that there was no income limit to your ability to get a guaranteed student loan, which was highly subsidized. Mind you, '78, remember what interest rates were doing in '78? We were looking at 14% interest rates, inflation was running in double-digit figures, and here was this guaranteed student loan program that had no interest payments while you were in school, and once you got out, if you kept the loan, it was still capped at, 7 or 8%. So what did people start doing in 1978? They started arbitraging from the GSL to their own savings accounts. And high-income families, they didn't all do this, but a number of them did, loaned their kids up to the hilt, got this money at no rate of interest while the kid was in school for 4 years, put it in their money market fund at 14%, let the money accumulate. When the kid graduated, you paid off the loan, you had a huge windfall. That was a completely unintended, stupid move on the part of the people in '78, and finally they got it settled in '81. But that's part of the story why income limits got put back on loans, I think. There was another fear and another problem with this approach that the economists have been promoting, is that people were afraid Pell Grants would come to be seen as welfare, us versus them, as opposed to low tuition across the board is sort of like Social Security, we are paying ourselves. And so part of the reason for constantly trying to move Pell Grants higher up the income scale was to move it away from this kind of welfare model, which was thought to be a stigma. Now, when the Reagan administration came in, at least in this field, that did mark an end of an era. It was clear to me by 1981 or 82 that the kind of policy analysis, the kind of maintenance of effort, the care and feeding of these programs, the attempts to improve them, that was no longer on the table. We had entered a kind of ideological period where the administration knew what was right. They desperately wanted to undermine, and Carter had just created the Department of Education in his last year or so of office. The Reagan Republicans thought that was a travesty and they wanted to kill it. They assumed it was just his way of pandering the teacher unions. So they were out to kill the Department of Education, and they tried, if they could have killed the Pell Grants, they would have killed them. They couldn't have managed to kill them, but they certainly suppressed them for years. But I could see that the era where staying at Brookings and writing about these things would be kind of a pointless exercise because there wasn't any audience for that sort of work. So I left and went on to other things. Let me wrap this up quickly by just commenting on the for-profits. They do come across in the book as an unmitigated evil. I mean, if there is pure evil in the world, it is to be found in your 3 chapters. I have a slightly less, I think it's a little bit more of a gray story than a black and white story. I think for me, there was what they exposed to the country was that many of our traditional institutions were not serving adult part-time working students, and that's the market they first entered, most of them, and they just entered it smartly. They worried about convenience and timing. You could go to the University of Phoenix and start a program on November 7th or November 21st. I mean, they could get you into the stream. You didn't wait till September or January. They could lay your whole program out for you. The original University of Phoenix didn't accept people younger than 23. You had to have a job. I can remember meeting with people out there in the year 2000 or so, and they were bragging about the average income of their students was $55,000. Many of them didn't borrow at that point. The problem was they got sold, when they went public and went on the market, stock market, they got sold as a growth stock. They got all confabulated with the tech boom of the early 2000s, and so people were pushing them for 30% growth year over year, and that caused them to start doing increasingly some of the stupid things and perverse and in some sense immoral things that they did. I mean, they put their recruiters on commission, and as you point out, during the Bush administration, they had a very light regulatory interest in this group. A woman, I forget her name, Sally somebody, who had been at Phoenix, became the chief federal higher education official, the assistant secretary for post-secondary education. So a lot of this 85-15 rule slipped to 90-10, and I don't disagree with a word you say about the nonsense on that. I was most interested to learn that came out of the GI Bill era, World War II GI Bill era. I had no idea that that's where that started. I think at this point, I think there are some for-profit institutions that are at some level trying to do the right thing and perhaps aren't all bad. And I think there are a lot of bad apples, and they don't have a regulatory framework that fits them very well. As you point out, the current administration has been struggling with this gainful employment legislation, which is the best club they've got, and that's been awkward. It's not a good way somehow to do this. This is too complicated. It takes too long to even figure out when there's a violation of it. I don't know if they'll ever get that one straight. But I will say, the book left me with the feeling that your view was that these schools are just going to continue to soar. In point of fact, in the last 2 years, they've just been hammered. Their stocks are down dramatically. Their enrollments are down in many cases. Part of it was they got some really bad PR. 60 Minutes, did a couple of exposés. There are legal lawsuits. I get called about once a month from some legal firm that's doing a class action lawsuit against a for-profit and wanting me to be a witness. The Harkin report is a devastating comment. It's gotten too little attention, as you suggest. The GAO did a fantastic exposure on them where they videotaped something like 15 recruiters lying to kids about what what it costs and what you get from it, and it's just a lot of misinformation. So I think all of those things, plus gainful employment, plus the Obama administration has not been their friend, has put some real pressure on them. And so whereas they were on from 2009, 2010, they came out in the early part of the recession just booming, but it's really, for many of them, flattened out now. So their future isn't quite as clear to me as I would have even guessed 2-3 years ago. The final chapter, as I say, I think I'm right in saying you don't provide grand recommendations for this, that, or the other thing, but mainly a call to order and to reason and to public purposes and to good citizenship. And I can do nothing more than applaud that. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions. Anyone interested in asking a question, I'd ask you go to the mics on either side of the room, identify who you are, and ask your question.
There goes my finance class.
Hello. Is this on? Hi, I'm Ethan Schrum. I'm at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture here at the University of Virginia. And I have both a general and a specific question for Suzanne. So the general question has to do with the way that you've presented the argument here. And I very much enjoyed your presentation, by the way, and appreciate all these fascinating statistics and so forth. But it seems like this is sort of framed mostly in political or policy terms, which is maybe not surprising given that we're in a school of public policy here. But I'm thinking about some maybe normative or cultural issues and thinking about what kind of a good a college education is and maybe some of the frameworks in which we've defined these things. So I hear you pretty much sticking to thinking about a college education as an economic good, not necessarily talking in terms of its impact on citizenship or the higher learning as a good in itself, as intrinsically good, as intellectual adventure, and any of those things. I do wonder if you talk about that in the book, or if you don't, what it might change to consider that kind of framing. And in a related way, it seems like we have a situation where for a lot of the kinds of demand that you're describing, especially for the for-profit schools, it's pretty much coming into a situation where the thought is that you must have a college degree in order to succeed in the marketplace, in the job force to some extent. It seems to me that that's a product of a sort of decades-long process that involves both the decline of American manufacturing and other sorts of pathways to work, along with this sort of credential society situation that Randall Collins has described. So there are these sort of larger forces here. I wondered if you could address that a little bit. The more specific question has to do with the really interesting slide, which was about state expenditures over time. And it was pretty quick, but what I took from it was that there were two lines at the bottom, which were fairly flat given the scale, which were expenditures on higher education and prisons. And then there were these sharply increasing lines on K through 12 and Medicaid. Now, part of those might be covered by federal grants to the states, which are then required to be used on those things. But I wonder if you could comment a little more on the increase in K through 12 and Medicaid expenditures vis-a-vis higher education.
Great, thank you. So I really love your first question. And it's the question I found myself thinking about by the time I got to the end of the book, was about the broader public purposes of higher education. And I was really struck, to the extent that in doing work about these very things. I was interested in that book, in the impact of getting advanced education, actually whether it was through vocational training or going to college, on people's civic engagement, their subsequent participation in politics and civic organizations. And I found that controlling for other factors, those veterans who used the GI Bill to get more education became more involved in civic life and so on. I have a PhD student, she was a PhD student, Deandra Rose, who's joining the policy school at Duke next year, who also looks at this for, and finds that women who use civilian student aid have actually become more involved in politics as a result of that kind of their opportunity to get more education. I think that we make a mistake today in politics by framing higher education as being, as having benefits that are accrued only to the individual and his or her family. And that we need to think more broadly about these kinds of rationales that are, more important for the economic growth of the whole society, for the health of democracy, and so on. So, I end up just thinking about those things, but I would encourage more of that conversation. And then in terms of that graph about what's happening at the state level, which I realize I remember quickly. And if I had it on a different scale, what you would see is that higher ed spending by the states has been very flat over that point in time, whereas the increase in, there has been quite a dramatic increase in spending on prisons. You just can't tell because it's such a small proportion relative to spending on Medicaid K-12 education. But the key thing going on there is that states are spending more on the things that are defined as mandatory spending, whereas higher ed is discretionary spending. So it's what pays the price for the other things. You have more people who are being sentenced to prison, you have more kids who qualify to go to K-12 education public school, then you have more spending on those things as well.
Plus, it's the one big area where there is another revenue source, the tuition.
Well, that's right.
You don't charge tuition for prison.
Exactly. And there's one of the things I found myself thinking about by the time I got to the end of the book is that there is a sort of perverse incentive there in the way federal student aid is structured for states. Because if state legislators are looking at all these competing demands, they know that if they don't do much for higher ed, that the colleges will raise tuition, and then more federal dollars will flow into the state because more students will qualify for more Pell Grants and student loans. So it's another, incentive. And so I end up wondering about these dilemmas of fiscal federalism, and are there ways to get around that, to require states to have more maintenance of effort in order to receive
Just to piggyback on that, after reading your book and this conversation, I got to doing hypothetical alternative history in my mind and saying to myself, what if the Pell Grants hadn't been legislated? What if the federal role had never really developed as it has? You can sort of see state legislators part of this offloading, saying the feds are going to have to take over the student aid thing. You wonder whether to some extent the cutback in state support is partly responsible or caused by the knowledge that there is this federal aid out there. I don't know if that was a huge factor, but Medicaid is a complicated piece of the story. I think that clearly is the big driver.
Yeah, and I mean, it also, this is where I talk about lateral effects, that to talk about higher ed policy and what's happening, you can't talk just about higher ed, you also have to talk about, say, healthcare policy. And, if we're going to have future investment in higher ed, we need to have ways to control healthcare costs.
Hi, Craig Volden, Batten School. So two things were brought up across these. One was the figure that was showing how much of family income does it cost to attend college, and the other was the high tuition, high student aid. I was just wondering, does that figure already take into consideration the higher student aid attached to the lower income?
That figure does not.
And
So,
how do you think that would play out?
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so that figure, the one showing percentage of family income that looks at your cost of attending career college. Yeah, I should probably make, a plan B of it that shows you, okay, now take into account the student aid that people are eligible for. Because tuition has gone up so much more quickly than student aid, I think you would still get a similar looking graph, though not as extreme. But I think, but it's worth having a graph where you show the sticker prices, because that's so important in families' minds as they're making decisions. But ideally, you show both. I just, for the book, I had initially 30 graphs, and maybe cut it back to 10. Yeah, and your second question was?
That was the question.
Hi, I'm Adam Hughes. I'm from the politics department. And so my question is for Suzanne. At a certain point, you sort of suggested that higher ed policies were maybe a part of your other book's idea, the submerged state, where we're not really visibly seeing where these benefits go to people. It's sort of hidden within the tax code. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about changes to the funding structure that you think would perhaps mobilize public opinion or find other ways of bringing this wildly divergent outcome in education to, I guess, the agenda of both the public and legislators.
Wow, that's a great question and a challenging question. And there are many ways in which higher ed spending is submerged. I mean, in part, in some of the ways I talked about in my submerged state of the move now to having tuition relief through the tax code. Something I don't touch on in the book that's a big important topic for someone to write a dissertation on is the advantages that especially private nonprofit universities get through the tax code in terms of charitable contributions, which is certainly very important, and usually people don't think of that as a benefit from the federal government. So there are those things. But there are other ways in which higher ed spending is less than visible to the public through other mechanisms. I've actually had conversations with folks who I'm sure you overlap with in your time in Washington, D.C., who talked to me about how over that history of change in student aid policy, there was an effort to make the policies work in an increasingly efficient manner. But through the process of doing that, perhaps the unintended consequences, they became more hidden to students that, federal government is actually helping you out to go to college. And I think that today, even Pell Grants are, to the average student who receives them, not all that visible as something coming to them from government to the extent they were early on. I mean, it's really striking me because when people got the GI Bill after World War II, they would say to me, Uncle Sam paid my way. There was no mystery about it. But today, you fill out this little FAFSA form, and then ultimately your college does something with the federal dollars, and they go to you, but they don't really go to you, and it's all very obscure. And I think that is demobilizing to citizens' involvement in these areas. And I've actually done a little work on this. It's not part of the book, but it's going to be part of a future project. But it ultimately, this is a submerged theme through this book. Where's the public? It's an area where we have all these trade associations at One DuPont Circle, the American Council on Education, all of these groups that bring together colleges and universities that are very involved. But the American public and college students and future potential college students is really not very involved. And the issues, like, if you start thinking about what are the issues for the next reauthorization of the Higher Education Act of 1965, your eyes will quickly glaze over. They're now they're real small bore issues, and it's hard to see how is this really going to affect big concerns about opportunity and citizenship and so on. And I about how policies are structured and whether that helps to mobilize people or not. But I also think that the public discourse has to be handled in a way that can sort of reach people more broadly, and then ultimately, of course, that we ought to have organizations that involve people and to be doing that.
So I have a question that has come to me from visits to my home state of Texas, where sometimes I mention to people that I teach in a politics department, and they ask, are there any Republicans in your department? And I get a feeling that somewhere out there in the heartland there's this perception that the professoriate is really overwhelmingly from one party. And I'm wondering whether you got any feeling when you talked about the polarization of politics and how that's affected the way we support higher education, whether that perception is part of the story, and maybe the Republican support for these new for-profit schools might be related to the fact that those professors don't have any particular reputation for what kind of a politics they have. Any thoughts?
It's a great question, and it's not one that I really deal with in the book, but it's something people have been asking me about, and I think it's got to be there. When I interview people in D.C. after Obama was elected, I interviewed people at one DuPont circle. They said to me, "We've never had a president who's so much an education president. He's talking about these issues more than any other president in the past." I remember that when at some point I was looking at donors to Obama, and I think, Harvard University is like, right up there on top, and all these other universities. And I'm sure, one could say, yeah, this is a pretty polarized environment in terms of where people's political affiliations are, where they give their campaign contributions. And this also kind of comes out of sort of like culture wars over the past couple of decades, and conservatives feeling that higher education is not their friend. And it's interesting how you raise where the for-profits come in here. I think the professors, those who teach at for-profits, I wouldn't want to make assumptions about what their alliances are. I've been getting really interesting emails from them since my op-ed came out, and some of them were saying, keep telling the story, please. I think that it's just very interesting to me how conservatives today see the for-profits being on their side, whereas not that many years ago that they really didn't, and they were very critical of it. So there's been a kind of shift in that. Intriguing question.
The way I've heard a number of the for-profit leaders use this little mantra: we're the tax-paying part of education, you're the tax-absorbing part. If you're a state legislator, that sounds like gold.
Other questions? Well, join me in thanking very much.
For your comments are wonderful, very generous, and I really appreciate it.
My view of the world through all that period. Of course, what I didn't have was a lot of this legislation.
Yeah.
But I did stress, I think it's the reason why they're the ones that are stressed the private rates. They're the ones that all these we're sort of driving that. The market taking over this. I think trying to do good saw that student.
Changed environment, economic inequality, and what families can afford to pay.
Well, the whole SAT thing was 100%.
Yes.
Not just ours.
Yeah.
It's sad, because people think of higher education, Bill Bowen had this wonderful phrase, are they inches of opportunity?
Right.
Sort of becomes an engine.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
except
Right.
the interesting question is what? I understand why did the for-profits find so many openings?
Well, I mean, I wanted to have an opportunity to respond to you. I mean, I agree with you that the for-profits were ingenious and doing things that I think, we and went after people who are very uninformed in school, but pretty easily. Higher tuition. Marketing budget, the kind of recruitment
he was all left-wing labor organizer. San Jose State, right there. They would, University of San Francisco hired him. He set up a Western Association. We're going to take the representation. Frank Newman encouraged him to break the mold and go out and start it. But he was original. Good guy.
fascinating story. Why people like Nancy. I have to say, when I approached this, I thought, well, there must be things that they're doing right and so on. The more I look at it, the more critical I feel. And I see these things as right. So this is kind of striking that, I actually just, since finishing the book, I've been looking at by race and ethnicity. Read his story of African Americans.
And within the sector, we come in at the beginning of the meeting and say, hey, we're doing this in themselves.
Take the schools of continuing education. They had entered this market. Couldn't we have killed you guys or stopped you at birth? You didn't. You never entered.
They've been ignored for the most part by
Yeah, people didn't pay much attention to it.
Yeah.
They'd go away.
Exactly.
Interesting part of
I can take that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Well, back to my recruiting dean. We have our third
Oh, that's what you're up to?
Really?
Uh-huh.
The guy did.
I couldn't make that.
Yeah, well, we have about a couple of cracker jacks in this search. I'm really pleased.
Good,
Oh.
I
good.
think we're going to pose horrendous problems with provost who has to make the choice.
Well, it was nice to be reminded of Councilman Weisberg. I had it been a while since I thought of it.
Oh, that's a great.
My question was going to be, there's a certain connection in your talk. You talk about polarization as one of the causes, not the root causes, but there's not much polarization because both parties are complicit in the policies you go on.
Most of the
Oh, okay. So the private things that are
although there's still some polarization dynamics that drive that. But all the teammates are.
So there is a serious partisan difference.
Yeah. It's just, anyway, I'll take more. But yeah, it's more of a longer atmosphere.
Much of it is what Paul Pearson describes as asymmetry, is that one time Republicans were willing to support this stuff for another. So it isn't like, it's like the Republicans have moved away from support rather than the Democrats have been.
Right, no, that is true.
There is no, my question would be, how are the people who are the progressives?
Yeah.
Most of the grassroots energy, when I say that, seems to be on the conservative side.
It's really interesting. It's interesting to see what Collins is for education reform, which is just right along the party line of the reform movement. There's like why are you marching on teachers? It's a great notion, like, it doesn't make any sense. But at the same time, that's sort of, I feel like a lot of folks It was great. I'm sorry that it was like I was teaching.
Terrific presentation. I don't use complex very much, but you do a huge piece of very well. Because some people do complex and they just look up there all the time, they read off it, and it annoys me. But you have good contact.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. One time I tried using complex, I did this offer for like 400 people and it was all metal and stuff. It's like that. I'll be on my camp, the slides are flying out.
Oh, we started with the animations.
Yeah, I messed it all up. So, I'll give you a